My name is Colin Coates, and I teach Canadian Studies and History at York University at the Glendon campus, the bilingual campus of York University. My main areas of research are early French Canada, particularly New France and Quebec. I also work in the areas of environmental history and in the history of utopias, and that starts in the 17th century with one of the early French settlements in what is now Montreal, but it extends up to the 1970s and 80s when I look at epicommunes as the last examples of the utopian settlements that I'm interested in. And the larger question that informs my work on those different areas, early French Canada, environmental history, and utopias, is how did European settlers adapt to and make sense of the new world setting in which they found themselves? And having said that, we always have to keep in mind that this was a new world for them. It was not a new world for the indigenous people that already existed. So it's partly a question of how Europeans adapted to make sense of the indigenous presence in what we now call Canada. The second question, what is one concept or one insight that is particularly useful in your work to better understand Canada? And here I would use the French term to explain the ways that I understand Canadian history or explain Canadian history. And this is a series of projets de société. Societal projects is a possible translation, but the French version works a bit better. And what this allows us to get at, by looking at the projet de société of different groups through Canadian history, is the active choice that individuals, families, communities, social classes make in determining the kind of societies in which they wanted to live. Okay, and this ranges, there's a big geography in Canada, so it ranges from one part of Canada to another, but it gets at the kind of idealized societies that people had in mind when they were trying to establish themselves in this new world. That's very clear in the sense of the study of utopias, but I think we see it in many other parts of Canadian history as well. The third question is, what would be the most relevant advice for emerging scholars in Canadian studies? And the advice I would make there, that I would give there, is to take advantage of the Canadian studies approach, of the multidisciplinary possibilities, the abilities to explore different types of evidence, to read broadly across different disciplines. There's nothing wrong with being disciplinary, but there's, I think, a huge advantage in being multidisciplinary, of not limiting yourself to the standard works in your own discipline, but going far beyond those to bring things together, to see how things interrelate. The argument that I would make, and I make to undergraduate students in explaining the advantage of Canadian studies, is that it's multidisciplinary because the world is multidisciplinary. We're faced by a number of different phenomena on an everyday basis, and you know, we naturally process that in our own minds, but when we try to understand things historically, we don't want, or in a contemporary fashion, we don't want to limit ourselves to, I think there's advantages to not limiting yourself to one specific way of knowing. So the multidisciplinary approach to Canadian studies is one that I consider very valuable in my teaching, but also in my research. And that would be my third answer to those questions.